Hey YouTube, welcome back. I have another build here for you. This is a build that I yoinked from someone in the public last Epoch Discord server. I've seen Leo over there talking about this dual wield Bladedancer Shadow Cascade build for quite a while now, farming above and beyond 1000 corruption, and I think he recently hit 2000 corruption. So this build is definitely tried and true. It seems a little bit stock standard to me, but it's definitely kind of under the radar. It is not an Umbral Blades character. It is not using any Shadow Daggers, which is a super strong mechanic for a Bladedancer, and we're just kind of doing fair Bladedancer things. We need to build critical strike chance. We don't have the busted crit vulnerability that used to exist before the 0.9 patch. We're just dealing melee damage, and it feels very, very good to play. This build does not have insane single target damage. I couldn't get it to a point where I'm like one-shotting bosses and I feel great about it. If you're trying to find something that just really dumpsters the tier 4 bosses in the game, I don't think this is the right build for you. But if you want to push a ton of corruption, and especially if you want to push corruption while doing it safely and very quickly, this is a great build. So the things that really stand out to me about this build before we go into the details of it are, well, there's a couple things. First of all, there's no Shadow Daggers. Shadow Daggers are busted. They have very high effectiveness of base damage. They always crit. They scale off of throwing damage and melee damage. They are so strong, especially with Umbral Blades. So that's why you see so many Bladedancers using Umbral Blades. And I get it. Umbral Blades, Umbral Blade Shadow Daggers is very strong. It's one of the best builds in the game, but I didn't want to play it. I wanted some variety and something else in my life instead. So what stood out to me about this game is that we're not, sorry about this build, is that we're not taking advantage of that mechanic, and I like it. I like that we have a build that's available outside of that busted Shadow Dagger mechanic. What's more is we are dual wielding swords, and we are not using a dagger at all. Most Bladedancer builds you see these days in 0.9, you'll see people using daggers because for Umbral Blades to apply Shadow Daggers, you need to have a dagger equipped. But the issue with that is in the Bladedancer Mastery, there's a node called Weapons of Choice. And that node gives you Glancing Blow chance with 2 swords equipped. And if you can get plus 40 Glancing Blow chance from that Weapons of Choice node, it is so much easier to cap your Glancing Blows without having to rely on Apostasy. So there's some conversation that goes on with Apostasy whenever you talk to people who play a lot of rogue builds. Apostasy is a node in the Bladedancer Mastery. Marksman has access to it as well. Apostasy says your dodge percent chance is added as twice as much chance to add it to receive a glancing blow, but you cannot dodge. So it takes 2 different layers of defense and it homogenizes them into 1 layer of defense. So the most dangerous thing about last Epoch, in my opinion, and in the opinion of people who push really high content, is getting stunned. And sometimes just not receiving a stun, just avoiding that projectile that's trying to off-screen you from some monster, is enough for you to be able to move out of the way. Especially if you're doing any kind of arena push or high-end content, Apostasy is not where you want to be, in my opinion. For low-end content, to get your gear up and running for the first time, Apostasy has its place. It's definitely not a bad node. It does something that's strong, but having 2 layers of defense without using Apostasy is what I try to do on all of my rogue characters. Another thing that I want to talk about before we dive into details here, there's a new amulet that's been introduced to the game. It's insane. This amulet's called Apostate's Sanctuary. It's on a bone amulet, which in and of itself is nuts because a bone amulet's very strong for giving you so much resistances on the implicit. This thing has between 360 and 480 flat life. It has a downside built into it. It says current health and ward lost when you directly cast a spell, and then health leak is disabled when you directly cast a spell for 4 seconds. There's a lot of things out there that are spells, even if you don't quite think so. You might think, oh, I could use this on Hammer Throw, and I could play a Smite Hammer Throw Paladin. But you're probably using Volatile Reversal, and Volatile Reversal counts as a spell. So one of the defining things about rogue builds is all rogues, including Falconer, when Falconer finally gets introduced, have no access to spells. There are no spells that you can directly cast in your character. So we get to mitigate all the downsides of Apostate Sanctuary, and we just have an amulet that's not too hard to farm. It has up to 480 flat life, and it gives you between 6 and 14% more damage to bosses and rare enemies. It happens to give some necrotic melee damage as well. I don't really get it. I don't know what this item is supposed to be doing, but it's nuts. It's really, really strong. And assuming that you can get this with 1 LP, which should be a reasonable thing to farm, hard, but reasonable, this is probably best in slot for most of your rogue builds out there. There are rogue builds that might want to use something else, sure, but this is a strong contender. It is very, very good. The last thing that I want to mention about this build before we go over the blessings and the inventory and the appearance tab. I wish we had a better MTX. I digress. The last thing that I want to go over is the number of shadows for this character. So this is something that we had to figure out in order to make this character as strong as possible, and that is how many shadows do we want with our Shadow Cascade. So when you use your Sync Strike, you place some shadows, and if you're right-clicking your Shadow Cascade, well, we have 4 shadows there. But if we use our Sync Strike and then we shift, we might have 5 shadows because shift can leave a shadow behind you. So the reason this is important is, well, in our Shadow Cascade, we have a node here that says more damage if you have a specific number of shadows. So if we have exactly 4 shadows, then this is something that really boosts up our damage. Doubles your damage, 100% more. So do we want to take the node in Bladedancer for Shadow Master? And this node says you can have an additional shadow, and then all your shadows deal increased damage. This is a strong node. It does do good things, but for Shadow Cascade specifically, it's not what we want because we lose access to this node here. The confounding factor here is that we also have access to idols and affixes that say things like increased damage per active shadow with Shadow Cascade. So we want to have as many shadows as possible with that, but at the end of the day, the way that we're going to build this character is only having 4 shadows. So when we shift, even though it creates a shadow, it's also going to consume one of the shadows behind us. So we only ever have 4 maximum shadows so that we can make use of the Shadow Cascade node for 100% more damage. That's an important part of this build. So we could only use 2 shadows if we wanted to, but only using 2 shadows and only having 2 points in Careful Assault doesn't quite do it. I tried it for a while. It makes your mana significantly easier. However, it's not trivial, but it's fairly straightforward in order to get to a point where you can still just spam Sync Strike and Shadow Cascade, and you will never really run out of mana. So I've seen people running around with like 20 mana regen. I don't feel as though I need any more than 17 mana regen. We have a couple affixes of mana efficiency with Sync Strike. We have tier 5 on our helmet, and then we have 12% on an idol and 15% on a different idol. And just that seems to be good enough for what we're currently working with. So you can have more mana regeneration. My Sync Strike costs 46 mana with 17 mana regeneration. It feels very reasonable for all the content. So let's jump into the nitty gritty of this build. First things first, I'll point out my life total. It's insane. My life total for this character is over 4,000, which is nuts. If I put on my other ring, I have 4,300 life, which is 863 endurance threshold on a Bladedancer, which is nuts. Holy crap. If we take off the Apostate Sanctuary, our life total looks a little bit more normal. We'll take this off. We have 3,600 life, which is still an astronomically high life total for this character. So put this one back on. This thing gives us, 700 life off this Apostate Sanctuary. I also don't have hybrid life on my gloves because I'm a scrub. So the life total in this character, we definitely have ways of juicing up as much life as possible. Just doing normal things like get percent health on all the pieces of gear that can have percent health, and get hybrid health on all the pieces of gear that can have hybrid health. This amulet, even with no LP, goes a really long way. We did go out of the way and farm some extra gear for this character. So you'll notice that we have an heirloom here that has a bunch of health, and then we LP'd more health onto it. We have some okay gear that has sealed tier 4% health, and then sealed tier 4 flat health. This is definitely bougie. This is pretty high-end stuff. But even if you don't have these sorts of things, if I start taking off my gear, my LP gear that I have here, you'll notice I still have 2,900 life with none of this gear on. You're going to have a lot of life on this character. There's a lot of room for you to get the affixes that you want. I still can't believe we have 4,300 life. Okay, so let's go through our character real quick. We'll start with Shadow Cascade. We talked about this node over here, so that's pretty good. We have the 2 points down here for the mana gain. These points are essential for us to have a build that feels good to play. We have 1 point over here. This is 15 times 2, so 30%-ish more damage. We have all the... I would like to have as many points in Rapid Expanse as possible. I think even having AoE on your gloves would feel nice, because what you'd like to have is as much AoE so that all of these spinning Shadow Cascades will hit single target. So you'd like to have as many points into that AoE node as possible. It's good for single targets, good for clear speed, just do it. And then we have the damage per shadow over here. Remember, we have 4 shadows all the time. So this is 3% per point, and 3 times 4 is 12. So this is 12% more damage per point times 4. So it's a great node for us. You could go for the attack speed stuff, but I've trimmed all of the attack speed out of my build in order to basically just be like a shift combo build. And your Sync Strike, or sorry, your Shadow Cascade already does not scale off attack speed. So by trimming this node out, we just have one fewer thing to worry about for the rest of the character, which I think feels very good for us. For Sync Strike, we have some normal looking stuff. We have some armor shred here. We don't hit particularly quickly, so we'd like to have some extra armor shred in the build. We have all of the mana efficiency. We have the node for +1 shadow. And then these nodes over here, this is a bit defensive, but I do end up liking this. If you didn't have these 5 points into the Crimson Shroud generation over here, you would instead put those points into Shadow Rush. We have good leech on our character, we have very good defense on our character, and in the Bladedancer Mastery, we even have this Skya Synthesis node, which gives us 90 health whenever we create a shadow. So when we jump, we create 4 shadows. When we dash, we create 1 shadow. So we have tons of that effect already. So specking over here to get some extra layer of defense feels quite good. I like this. For our shift is super normal looking. You could trim 3 points out of our cooldown recovery speed and put more 3 points into elusive. But I think the fastest farming version of this build is going to trim some life and trim a little bit of defense in order to get more cooldown recovery speed. So I suspect that you really do want these 3 nodes here. The rest of this is proccing our shurikens and then proccing our Shadow Cascade on the bottom right side. For our shurikens, this is pretty normal looking stuff. You've seen this once, you've seen it 100 times. We have some percent increased armor, the duration, we have some Fizz Shred when we're standing on top of a boss, and then the Pierce node here, so that's good. And the last but not least is the Smoke Bomb. We are not speccing anything into Umbral Assault. I know my camera's hiding this, but it's 0 out of 4. We're not doing any Shadow Chance here because we're already proccing all 4 shadows that we need with Sync Strike and with Shift. We would like to stand in a Smoke Bomb as much as possible, because when we do, you'll see that my throwing damage and my melee damage keep going up the longer that I stand in this thing. So not only that, but my Glancing Blow chance, I'm going to move my camera real quick. My Glancing Blow chance requires me to be standing in this thing. Goes down to 96, goes up to 86, goes up to 91. And then as I'm standing in this thing, we're going to be gaining our Glancing Blow chance. The rest of our Glancing Blow chance comes from Dust Shrouds. Chance to get a Dust Shroud when we use melee attack and hits from the Veil of Night. And also chance to get a Dust Shroud when it hits from our Shroud of Dusk here. In terms of Dust Shrouds, you might also use an affix on your body armor. You could have a sealed tier 1 affix, or maybe a tier 5 affix, chance to gain a Dust Shroud when you use a melee attack that hits. I really like that node, but this is the body armor that I ended up with, having a bunch of offensive percent increased damage modifiers as the prefixes instead. But you should know, the Dust Shroud when you use a melee attack that hits modifier, the prefix for your body armor, it's a really good choice. If you have one of those sitting around, I would consider using it, especially if you have as much life as this body armor has for me. So that's our skills there. Let's talk about a mastery. There's a couple of things we already said, but let's go over it again. So the Rogue base class is probably the best base class in the game. We have 42 points in it. One's kind of a throwaway node, but 36 or 40 or 42 points is pretty common because this stuff here is very, very strong for us. So attack speed, base damage. We have health, dexterity. I like this node a lot. Remember, dexterity gives us dodge when we shift, and it also gives us dodge all the time. We have some 155 for these nodes here. Less damage taken while moving, and we are almost always moving. When you use Sync Strike, you do not count as moving, but pretty much all the rest of the time, you do count as moving. Then we also have agility for gaining haste as much as possible, so we keep running around, and then percent increased damage per movement speed. We're about 100% movement speed, so this is what, like 20% increased damage per point, approximately. We have the dual wield, so we take the twin blade node. We want the glancing blows, so we take dodge and parry. And then we have 8 points into critical precision over here. Crit chance per equipped sword, and we have 2 swords equipped. We have 0 points in Marksman, 70 into Bladedancer. We have all of the all-stars here and nothing that's particularly fancy. So we have 8, 8, 5 for all of these nodes here. If you wanted to trim something and be less defensive and more offensive, you could trim the Shroud of Dusk. But this is 10 life per point. I really like this point. I'm very happy to have it here. But if you're going to trim something, you could trim this. 5 points into Pursuit for movement speed, 8 points into Once, so that when you get hit, you gain some flat dodge. And then the flat damage, of course, is excellent as well. Skyed Synthesis augments your leech to keep you nice and healthy when you're jumping around. We have 5 points into Blood Dance for our leech. This is our only leech in the build, the 5%. Flash and Steel, only 1 point here. 5% increased damage and getting that extra melee attack speed. We're not scaling attack speed at all, so we only have 1 point here. And then all 8 into Weapons of Choice, which is one of the reasons that I like this build so much, because we get so much glancing blow chance just from having 2 swords in each of our hands. We have 1 point in Argent Veil. If you put more points in this, you're scaling how much ward you get. If you want more ward for some reason, you can put more points in here. But just having 1 point in here is amazing. This is a very, very strong layer of defense. We have 5 points in a Critical Eye for as much crit vulnerability chance as possible. 5 points in All In for the extra crit multi. And then 5 points in Spellbreaker because I actually want the mana regeneration and I don't have Frailty elsewhere in the build because we're using a unique amulet there. So let's take a look at the gear real quick. This is pretty straightforward stuff. I'm going to talk about the prefixes, your suffixes. You're going to see one of the defining points about this build as we talk about the gear is that our blessings are a little bit weirder than you think they are. So before we talk about gear, I'm actually going to talk about blessings first. I know that's out of order for what I normally do. So let's take a look at this view because I like to do this when I'm talking about blessings. We have a lot of resistance. We don't need Fizz Shred because our shurikens have Fizz Shred built into them. We don't need crit multi. We have tons of crit multi already. So what do we need? We have Void Res from Black Sun, making our gearing even easier. You could go crit multi if you want to be offensive, but then it makes your gear a little bit harder to do. We have Lightning Res for Ending the Storm. We have Crit Avoidance, which along with the Crit Avoidance body armor caps your crit avoid. If you're not using the Crit Avoidance body armor, then you need Crit Avoidance on a piece of gear, just like 30% or so. And then we have Flat Armor, which I love flat armor. You could go percent endurance here, but flat armor is so good, especially combined with shurikens giving you so much percent increased armor. And then, back to this view, we're actually using Cold Res from the Age of Winter. So we have very good resistances here. I could trim some of these resistances as well. I'm probably not going to work on this character anymore personally, but this is what we're working with. Remember, the new body armor here has Lightning Res on it, which is why my Lightning Res is so high. Because we have so many resistance blessings, it allows us to do things like have health on our rings. Normally, I'm not a very big proponent of putting health on your rings unless you have a very high-end character like this one that you've been playing for not 3 days, not 5 days, but a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. Because then the health starts to make a lot more sense once you finish out getting perfect pieces of gear elsewhere in your character. So we do have a lot of exalted flat health on our character and even some fancy LP rings. But again, like I showed you previously, you're going to have 3,400 life even if you don't have those fancy pieces of LP gear for your character there. So what do we have? We have Vitality and Mana Efficiency with Sync Strike. The Vitality, you can swap it out if you want to. I like it. I like being as tanky as possible. The Sync Strike, you're definitely going to want. That's very important for you. For your body armor, there's a handful of prefixes that you could use there. Damage of skills used by shadows is fine. Damage per active shadow with Shadow Cascade, multiply this by 4 because we have 4 shadows all the time. Things like plus levels to Shadow Cascade. I have a sealed tier 1. I think tier 2 or even tier 3 could be fine. Remember, if you're using those nodes, you're going to end up getting some extra AoE and maybe some crit multi with Shadow Cascade. It could be a fine thing to do. I'm not in love with it, but I think just having +1 is fine enough because the difference between +1 and +2 is like, well, +2 you need tier 5, but a +1 you only need a sealed tier 1 affix. So I think I'm going to advocate the sealed tier 1 affix and then maybe getting some AoE on your gloves like we have over here. Other things, what is it? The chance to get a Dust Shroud when you use a melee attack that hits is a very strong affix as well. So there's all sorts of things. Technically, Vitality is fine, but I think you have enough life in other places that you don't want Vitality on your chest piece here. For your belt, you want Mana Regeneration because we do want 17 or 18 or 19 Mana Regen for this build. For our Katanas here, our Katanas would like to have as much flat physical damage as possible. So we want Flat Fizz, we want melee crit. And then for our 2 suffixes, we want a suffix that has percent dodge on both of them. And then one of them should have chance to shred armor on hit, and the other one should have chill. Unfortunately, I have ignite instead of chill, but those are the 2 katanas that you'd like to use for this character, and it's pretty specific. So if you can get them exalted, that's awesome. If you can't get them exalted, I think you just use a non-exalted one instead. For our rings, we want a little bit of crit chance, but we also want things like dexterity. We want things like physical damage. But here's the thing: if we have affixes like this, like increased damage per active shadow, and we could get idols as well. We can get idols that say increased damage per active shadow. We have access to a suspicious amount of percent increased damage, especially when we're using smoke bomb to gain percent increased damage over here as well. So we actually don't need like percent increased physical damage as a prefix. I'd rather have a different exalted modifier instead of exalted physical damage. Exalted crit chance, fine, that's okay. Or even just using some unique items like this to get some extra life. Or I've been swapping into an item like this. Remember, we are a melee build. When you have chance to apply Doom on hit, Doom says enemies take percent increased melee damage. So this is a nice way of getting 20% increased or 20% more damage for your character, because I don't have any access to enemies take increased damage. So the first instance of that is kind of like more damage. So you have a lot of room for expression, for like customizing the build for exactly like you want it to be. You can use some rings like this, or you can use double opal rings along with cooldown recovery speed on your boots, and you could even go cooldown recovery speed on your belt and have as much cooldown as possible so that you can shift and farm your 2000 corruption even faster. For your gloves, you want hybrid health, because I don't have hybrid health here. You don't really need melee attack speed. It's not important for you. So things like dexterity, things like strength could be fine as well, give you even more armor, make you tankier. But I think AoE is important. I think AoE is something that you're really going to feel happy with if you can get AoE on a pair of gloves like this. For your boots, cooldown recovery speed is excellent. You should get as much as possible. I only have tier 3, unfortunately. And then for our relic, we have some extra poison resistance. I would take the poison resistance off this if I could and put on something else instead. I don't know what, but this relic is fine. It's got mana regeneration, crit multi, which I'm happy with. I don't think you need 82 poison res. It's fine. It's just a lot of poison res. Do we really need that much poison res? All right, so this is the kind of thing you're looking for. Whatever your suffixes demand from you, you put on there. But I don't think you need a poison res suffix on this character. I think we're good enough without it. For our idols, I mentioned these a little bit already. We have two huge 1x4 mana efficiency idols. There are better suffixes that you can get. You can get things like damage for shadows, or damage for skills used by shadows, something like that. The mana efficiency feels great. I said before, my Sync Strike costs 46 mana, and I think that's a good place to be. 46 mana there and 17 mana regeneration is just about perfect for how I like it. One of the reasons that we can get so much health on a character like this is that we have idols, these large 1x3 idols that have percent health on them. These are probably undervalued in general, but they're very, very strong. So getting a percent health prefix along with some kind of DPS suffix, increased damage of attacks used by shadows, increased damage of attacks used by shadows, just like that. Once you get better resistances in your build, you can even swap into 1x2 idols, getting a percent health and flat health like this. And I suspect, don't quote me on this, if you get good gear, you could probably get 5,000 life on this character. I don't want to do that because I think I'd have a panic attack just seeing 5,000 life on a Bladedancer. But you could do that if you want to, because I'm pretty sure that you could. All right, so that about covers it. We walked through blessings, we talked about our gear, we talked about idols, and we talked about our skills and our mastery. This character's been really fun to play. I already have confirmation from actually 2 other people who've been farming very high-end corruption with this. 1,500, 2,000 corruption, playing these Bladedancers and just pushing as far as they possibly can because they don't have negative attention span the same way that I do. So I like this build. If you're looking for a character that just memes on bosses, I do not think this is the build for you. But if you want like a nice all-rounder, something that's very fun to play, very fast, can push high corruption, yeah, this build has lots of layer defense. It's got excellent mobility with shift and building a bunch of cooldown recovery speed. It has room for personal expression because you can kind of gear it however you want. If you want more cooldown, less cooldown, more life, different unique items, there's room for you to customize this character. And I think almost most importantly, if you made it this far in the video, this character's been fun to build. It's been fun to farm up unique items. It's been fun to farm up the right body armor. It's been fun to try to seal tier 4 modifiers and even sometimes succeed in sealing tier 4 modifiers. So this character's been really fun to play. It's been fun to build, and I hope that you enjoyed as well. Yeah, I will link both the build planner for this particular character and the build planners that was given to me by Leo from the public Discord, and you can kind of compare those notes and see what people have been doing when they're pushing up to 2000 corruption on the monolith web. Thanks for being here. If you're playing some Bladedancers that aren't using Shadow Daggers, tell me about it because I like them. I'll see you next time.